As we just heard on the news, the Harper government saying it will introduce legislation to ensure that consideration for the victims and the safety of the public is the first concern when decisions are being made about dangerous, mentally disordered persons being released into our communities. James Moore is the MP for Port Moody, Westwood, Port Coquitlam, and Senior Minister for British Columbia. James Moore, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
What is the problem you're trying to fix here?
An imbalance in the justice system for those when for victims of families and communities when somebody is deemed not criminally responsible for a criminal act that has taken place. We all know the Alan Schoenborn case very well. Alan Schoenborn murdered his 3 children, and he was deemed to be not criminally responsible for having done that because of it was deemed that his mental faculties weren't all there. Once that happens in any kind of circumstance, then that person is then put into a facility, not a jail, but they're still segregated from the public. But in the current system, when somebody is deemed not criminally responsible, they can apply for day passes. They can apply for other benefits or access to the community that otherwise wouldn't be available. What has happened is, in this particular case, and it's been happening in other parts of the country as well, is that when that person applies for access to the community, there is not adequate protection for the community. There's not adequate consideration given to the victim. And as a matter of fact, in the Schoenborn case, the family wasn't contacted. The family wasn't involved. There was no consideration for a community. And worst of all of this is that whenever somebody like Alan Schoenborn applies for day passes back into the community, they can do it every single year, requiring families every single year to relive the trauma and torment of having to tell their stories about why it is that this person should not be allowed into the community.
Well, let's pick up on that after the break. James Moore, my guest, the MP for Port Moody, Westwood, Port Coquitlam. I want to find out exactly what the government plans to do up next on CKNW News Talk 980. Talking with James Moore, MP for Port Moody, Westwood, Port Coquitlam, Senior Minister for British Columbia, as the government announces it will make changes, as Mr. Moore has been outlining, changes at least in part driven by the Alan Schoenborn case here in British Columbia, where Mr. Schoenborn found not guilty by reason of a mental disorder and the deaths of his 3 children, and can apply for day parole every year. James Moore, you've outlined the problem. What is your government going to do to fix it?
Well, a few things, as I said. We want to make sure that those who are high-risk or dangerous offenders are not treated the same way as others. We want to give them special consideration to make sure that there's a much higher standard of burden put on them before they can even apply for access into the community. Second, we want to make sure that families don't have to go through the torment every single year and at the whim of those who are currently incarcerated to have to go before panels and to explain and to revisit their torment and torture of the history of the crime that took place in order to appeal for the person not to be allowed into the public. Third, we want to make sure that victims, if there is any opportunity for release of an offender or a person, that victims would be absolutely guaranteed that there will be no possible way that the person would be in contact with them. Fourth, we want to make sure that there's community involvement in it. Greg Moore, the mayor of Port Coquitlam, Richard Stewart, the mayor of Coquitlam, who are in the communities out here in the Tri-Cities that are immediately impacted by the Alan Schoenborn case, publicly and accurately said that communities have not been engaged in this process, and they will now be involved in the process and consulted with if there's any opportunity for release. And fifth, and most importantly, we want to make sure that all those who are currently in the system, because very often, as you know, Sean, something happens in a system and the system is broken, so a government reacts and says, well, we've learned from this, so that's why going forward we will make sure that this won't happen again. No, the reforms that we're planning on, we are going to be putting in place in legislation are reforms that will impact all cases in the future and those who are currently in the system.
How do you ensure no possible contact if, in fact, somebody like Mr. Schoenborn was given a day pass or something like that? How do you ensure that there is no contact with the family?
Mandate that there's accompaniment with any kind of escort, first of all, and second is that victims make sure that they are contacted by.
So they're told. So the victims' families are at least told.
They're told, and we make sure that the offender does not come anywhere near them at any time, and there's a radius around them.
Announcing plans to legislate is one thing. Actually introducing legislation is another. When might we see this go to the House of Commons?
early next year. The House of Commons sits from now through until the week before Christmas, and right now we're passing the budget legislation. We'll table this legislation early in the new year, and we hope for a quick passage. And by the way, we arrived at this legislation after consulting with provinces across the country, and Liberal, NDP, Conservative governments all across Canada provincially have agreed with these reforms. They want to see them enacted, and we're hopeful that the opposition parties in Ottawa will agree with Prime Minister Harper and myself that this needs to be done, and done quickly in a nonpartisan way.
And sorry, in terms of the reviews, are we going from 1 year to 3 years? That's sort of the rumor out there today.
We are going to be lengthening it. The victims' families and victims' advocates have asked for a 3-year window, and we've listened to them. James
Moore, great to talk to you. Thanks so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
James Moore, the MP for Port Moody, Westwood, Port Coquitlam. You've heard the changes that are coming after the 4:30 news. We'll open up the phone lines. Is the government doing enough? Do you approve of these changes, sparked, as I say, very much in part by the Schoenborn case here in British Columbia? We'll open up the phone lines after the 4:30 news. Right now, we'll take a break on CKNW News Talk 980.
The World Today on CKNW News Talk 980.